She's fighting to keep the ocean safe and plastic-free. Anja Brandon is joining us to talk about the harmful effects of microplastics in the ocean and why we should all be concerned about the plastic we use on a daily basis. This is Advocate Now. Anja, I want to start with when you were a PhD student at Stanford University, and your research focused on creating new ways to use biology to break down plastic waste. But then you realized the enormity of the situation. So you sort of shifted your focus at that point. Tell me what that moment was like when you had that epiphany.
Yeah, that's a great question. I spent 5 years investigating insects and bacteria and enzymes that could break down these plastics. And the science was so cool and innovative. And there's really important science to, continue innovating on these kind of major environmental challenges. But towards the end of my PhD, I took a step back and I realized the work that I was doing was going to be a literal drop in the ocean compared to how much plastic we produce every single day. I actually calculated it. I realized that it would take over a quadrillion of the insects that I was studying to break down plastics, to break down the amount of plastics we produce in one day. This made one thing very clear to me. The amount of plastics we produce is just untenable. Half of the plastics we have ever made have been made in the last 20 years alone. And no amount of supercharged microorganisms or bacteria is going to change that. So put simply, I realized to address this plastic pollution crisis, we need to make less plastic. So that's when I transitioned to working on science-based policies to do precisely that.
And not only do we need to make less plastic, but we've been encouraged to recycle plastics for years. And a more recent study found that plastic recycling is polluting the water and the air. So can you tell us more about this and other recent findings?
Yeah, this study is really concerning, and it really does add to a growing body of research that's finding more and more new sources of these harmful microplastics. What this study doesn't tell me is that we should stop recycling plastics. So long as we are producing and using plastics, recycling really is the best end of life scenario for these materials to keep us from needing more and more virgin plastic, which are made out of fossil fuels, and to keep plastics from entering our environment or winding up in incinerators or landfills. But we know that once microplastics enter our environment, they're all but impossible to remove and clean up. So these studies and the other studies about new major sources of microplastics, from outdoor paint that peels off into the environment to microfibers from our clothes to the rubber from the cars we're driving. These studies are really important because they help us identify the source of these microplastics so we can figure out how to stop them before they can enter the environment. For recycling facilities, there are air and water quality permits that we should push to update to make sure they're addressing microplastics. For our clothes, we can push to require that our washing machines include a filter, just like our dryers already do, to capture these microfibers. We're actually working on a bill right now in California that would make it the first state to pass this type of requirement. That's all to say that this research is really important, especially on microplastics, because it's so important to provide people like me working on the policy, the information we actually need to tackle this crisis.
I want to talk about what happens once these microplastics get into the ocean and the environment, how they can affect us. I mean, what are some of the harmful effects?
Yeah, that's a great question. So right now we know that around 11 million metric tons of plastic enter the ocean every year. That's more than a garbage truck's worth of plastic every single minute. And by weight, that is mostly our large macroplastic items. So a lot of the items we interact with on a day-to-day basis to plastic fishing gear that are out floating in the ocean. But by count, microplastics are by far the most common type of plastic pollution in our ocean. And they end up becoming available to the entire food web. Because of their small shape and size, these microplastics can get lodged in animal guts and gills and tissues. And this is a challenge across the entire food web now, down to the things that we as humans are eating. These plastics can also leach the chemicals, some of the toxic components that are used in plastic manufacturing, kind of hitch a ride along these plastics and end up wherever they end up in animal tissues to the food web. And it's even scarier because we now know that humans ingest these microplastics through the food we eat, as I mentioned, to the water we're drinking, and of course, the air we're breathing. Once these microplastics end up in our body, we know some leave the body, but also some stay for long periods of time. And we don't really know what that impact is on our health yet, but preliminary research is not looking promising. So we really need to focus in on keeping these microplastics out of the environment in the first place, because once it's out there, we know there's essentially no way to get them back.
And I want to talk about some of the things that we can do to be proactive, because I try to mainly drink out of glass bottles, or I check to make sure the plastic that I'm drinking out of is BPA free, chemical free. I'm careful not to heat plastic containers or put hot food in them. I mean, is that the right thing to do? And what else should we be doing?
Yes, those are absolutely the right things to be doing, and great examples of the individual actions we can all take. When we're able to, we can consider these kind of smalls but really meaningful actions, like bringing a reusable water bottle or coffee mug with us, taking reusable bags to the store, or skipping plastic cutlery when you get takeout. Another great individual action is joining a beach cleanup. We're just about a month away from Ocean Conservancy's annual International Coastal Cleanup Day that takes place in September. And these cleanups obviously have an immediate positive impact on the health of the ocean. And they provide really important data about all the plastics that we're picking up out in the environment that we can use to drive policy to keep plastics from getting out into the ocean in the first place.
And I think that recyclability and compostability are still confusing for a lot of people. The plastic industry is still encouraging us to recycle plastic. So how do we know what is and what isn't recyclable?
It's a great question. And right now, there's not a great answer. You really shouldn't need a PhD to figure out what is and is not recyclable, but that's basically the case right now, in part because of how these products are labeled. There's that little number at the bottom of all of our plastic packaging that's often surrounded by that recycling symbol, the chasing arrows. And just because it's there doesn't actually mean it's recyclable. Even worse, labels can say things like, please recycle me, but not actually be recyclable in your local area. So for recycling and composting to work, we need to be honest and transparent about what is and is not recyclable. We can do that through better labeling, and we're working on that. But we also need to take the guesswork out of recycling by requiring that all of these plastics we interact with on a daily basis are designed and made to be recyclable in the first place. So there's no more standing over recycling bins, second guessing what goes here, what goes there. We can actually know with confidence that all of our materials and packaging are recyclable by design. And there's many ways that we can do that. We already have some tools in place, from industry supported guides for how to actually design these materials, and laws, like a law that we helped pass recently in California that will actually require this by law for all packaging and plastics across the state of California.
Such an important topic, Anja, and such important work that you're doing. Thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm Sonia Baghdadi. Thanks for watching and advocating. For more stories and content like this, visit advocate.com and advocatechannel.com.